Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghost and Spirits video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue chapter 5, in this case part 4 of the book The World's Greatest Ghosts by Roger Bohr. This one continuing once again with the theme of ghosts and the highways and skyways. And then I think this will actually help wrap up this chapter here. So we've already seen some interesting examples of some ghostly encounters associated with various items, either there on the road, sometimes in the sky, sometimes in the sea as well. This one will continue that theme altogether, including this next part, which apparently has to do with some dead airmen. So let's go ahead and let's feature these segments here. And then at the very end, I'll give my own thoughts and opinions. I'd love to hear what your own thoughts are as well. First one has to do with this. It's the segment called The Pilot's Packed Reunion of Dead Airmen. So here's what it says. A disused British aerodrome on the flat, empty waste of East Anglia has not heard the roar of aircraft engines since World War II. Yet, the aura of those days is still there in ghostly form. Bircham Newton in Norfolk, Virginia, was a Royal Air Force aerodrome that survived 2 world wars. It was built in 1914 and in recent years has served as a base for students taking building trades courses. A film team visited the old aerodrome to make a management training film and went to work in what once had been the officers' mess. Suddenly, and without apparent cause, a heavy studio lamp fell towards the head of Peter Clark, a member of the film crew. As it was about to hit him, it swerved, as if pulled by some unseen hand, and then crashed across the table. On its own, this incident would have prompted little comment, but with the events that followed, it is more significant. Just behind the old officers' mess are 2 squash courts built just before World War II. It was here that another member of the film unit had a terrifying experience. After discovering the old courts, he borrowed a racket and a ball, and the only key to the building. He asked if any of his colleagues wanted to join him. No one was interested, so he set off to play on his own. Now, the 2 courts were side by side. At first, the film man practiced on the left-hand court. Then, for no particular reason, he moved over to the other court. And so while knocking the ball around, he heard footsteps along the viewing gallery behind them. At first, he paid no attention, assuming that one of the film crew had come to watch him play. Then he remembered he had locked himself into the building and was completely alone. For a moment, he remained silent. Then he heard a sigh which made the hairs on his neck prickle, and turning around, he saw a man in a RAF uniform staring at him from the gallery. Suddenly, the figure vanished. The film man fled. Later, he confided in Peter Clark, who suggested that they return to the squash court that night and try to record the footsteps on the crew's tape recorder. Clark explained, "It was a calm, warm summer night when we returned to the courts. We visited the left court, which felt completely normal, but when we went into the court on the right, the atmosphere was so cold, so frightening that it was like stepping into another world." The 2 men switched on the tape recorder and waited, but eventually fear got the better of them and they decided to lock the machine in the court and come back when the tape had run out. What they discovered when they replayed the tape was extraordinary. They heard the sounds of aircraft, voices, and clanking machinery, uncannily like the noises of a busy aircraft hangar in wartime. Even more disturbing was a strange, unearthly groaning. The tape was analyzed by a BBC engineer who admitted that he and his colleagues were perplexed. There was no technical fault with the machine. Few outside noises could have penetrated the 9-inch brick wall, and the tape was brand new, so old recordings could not have come through. The mystery of the tape absorbed Peter Clark. He persuaded friends to return to the aerodrome with a medium and then hold a seance. As soon as the medium entered the courts, he went into a trance and began to speak in the voice of the dead airmen. Clark described the scene. It was extraordinary. The medium's face became twisted, and he seemed to have difficulty in breathing. His name was Wiley. Clark discovered in local records that there had indeed been an airman named Wiley who had committed suicide at the aerodrome during World War II. Inquiries also revealed that the aerodrome had been haunted for years. A student attending one of the construction courses had his bedclothes pulled off of him at night by the invisible being. Another had his curtains torn down and then thrown across the room. And a senior engineer claimed he had been tapped on the shoulder 3 times while working alone in the attic of the officer's mess. The experience so unnerved him that he refused to work there again. One man claimed that he saw a figure in RAF uniform walk through a solid wall which had been built there since the war. He was so frightened he refused to complete his course and then left the following day. Some of the psychic recordings were broadcast by the BBC, and afterwards many listeners wrote in complaining that their pets had been disturbed by the noises. A BBC television team decided to investigate and arrived at the aerodrome with 2 leading spiritualists. Unaware of the details of the tapes or the hauntings, the spiritualists first entered the left squash court and declared it normal. But as soon as they entered the right-hand court, they excitedly claimed that it held a presence, the ghost of a dead airman. One of the spiritualists, the famous medium John Sutton, began to meditate. He immediately became entranced by the dead airman and spoke as a man called Dusty Miller, who had been killed with his friends Pat Sullivan and Jerry Arnold. When Sutton came out of the trance, he was able to explain that the 3 airmen had been keen squash players. They made a pact that if anything should ever happen to them, they would try to meet up again in the building. They had all been killed when their plane crashed behind the church, which had a tower but no steeple. He had never been to the area before, so could not describe the exact location. Sutton also explained, people who die suddenly do not always realize they are dead, and so do not understand when they cannot communicate with the living. He said the 3 airmen had been held earthbound at Bircham Newton because they had no idea that the crash had killed them. He put the occurrences down to the spirits trying to contact people because they desperately needed help. Having contacted the dead airmen, the spiritualists were able to lay them to rest by a simple exorcism. After checking records, investigators found that a plane had indeed crashed behind Bircham Church during the war, killing the crew of 3. The church has a tower, but no steeple. Next segment is called The Grief of Henry Watts. At the edge of a quiet Wiltshire road stands a small stone cross. Travelers hurry along the road between Marlborough and Hungerford could be excused if they missed a tiny memorial to the 14-year-old boy who tried tragically at a spot just over a century ago. Grass and country flowers almost hide the cross on which are transcribed the simple words A.H.P. Watts, May 12, 1879. But 4 people driving home from the cinema on a quiet autumn night in 1956 will never forget the memorial, for they came face to face with the grieving ghost of the boy's father. Little Alfie Watts worked for a carter in the village of Axford, and it was here in 1879 that he met his death. Alfie and the carter were at the head of a team of 3 horses which suddenly bolted. The man and the lad ran alongside the heavily laden cart, struggling to halt the runaway team, but as the cart clattered through a steep-sided cutting, Alfie was thrown to the ground. The boy fell beneath the wheels and died of his injuries 2 hours later. Mourning villagers erected a memorial to him at that spot. Years passed and memories dimmed. Occasionally, someone remembered the stone cross and the brambles and grass were cleared away. Then in October 1956, Frederick Moss and his 3 friends were driving home from the movies to Marlborough when the headlights picked out a tall, thin, clean-shaven man standing in the middle of the road. He was dressed in a long brown coat and stood with his back to where the cross was almost hidden in the grass. As the car swept on, he made no attempt to get out of the way. Moss blew his horn, but still the figure stayed where it was. It did not even look up. The driver slammed on the brakes and stopped a few yards short of the figure, but as he got out to investigate, it suddenly disappeared. Moss and his friends searched the area with torches but found nothing. With the cutting walls rising steeply 9 feet on either side, it was impossible for anyone to have climbed up without having been seen. When Moss arrived home shaken, he told his wife what he had seen. As she heard the full description of the mystery man, something clicked in her memory. She was a native of the area and was born about 20 years after the accident. She said she clearly remembered the boy's father, Henry Pounds Watts, who died in 1907. He was a tall, thin man who dressed in a long brown coat and, unusual for the times, had neither a beard nor whiskers. The Mosses were in no doubt that this was the man on the road, a road which at that time was due to be widening, destroying the little cross. Perhaps Henry wanted to make sure that someone remembered his son's modest memorial before the road was widened. If that was his aim, it succeeded. The road was widened, but the cross was lovingly replaced nearby. Then there's a little mini segment that's called Spectral Spitfire. It says, people living near the famous Battle of Britain airfield at Biggin Hill, Kent, have often reported the sound of a wartime Spitfire returning from a sortie. Occasionally, the plane has actually been seen, screaming low towards the landing strip, then turning into a victory roll. Further east at Hawkinge, near Falkenstein, villagers have heard a flying bomb more than 3 decades after the Germans last launched one there in Britain. Next segment is called Dead Man's Quest for Justice. It says, a row in Britain's House of Commons during the First World War may have been responsible for the mysterious reappearance of a long-dead pilot. The flyer returned to Haunton Air Base 3 years after the crash that killed him. Member of Parliament Pemberton Billing, head of the Southampton Company, which later developed the Spitfire aircraft, accused the government in 1916 of doing nothing, while certain Royal Flying Corpsmen were murdered rather than killed by the carelessness, incompetence, or ignorance of their senior officers or of the technical side of service. One of the examples he cited was that of Desmond Arthur, an Irish lieutenant with No. 2 Squadron, who died in a crash over the Scottish airbase of Montrose on May 27, 1913. Arthur was gliding down from 4,000 feet, preparing to land, when the starboard wing of his BE-2 biplane folded in midair. As the tiny aircraft plunged, the pilot's seatbelt snapped, and he was thrown out of the actual cockpit. Ground staff watched him fall to his death, arms and legs flailing helplessly. There were no parachutes in 1913. The Royal Aero Club's Accidents Investigation Committee began a probe immediately and concluded that an unauthorized repair job on the plane's right wing had been botched and then covered up. Someone had broken a wingspan near the tip, repaired it with a crude splice, then concealed the work by stretching new fabric over the affected area. To Arthur's friends in the Royal Flying Corps, it added up to murder, but the offender could not be pinpointed. Billing used the Aero Club's findings as a basis for his 1916 onslaught in Parliament. He was as astonished as anyone when the government, anxious to avoid any scandal that might undermine public faith in its war effort, issued its own report on the crash. It said the wing repair explanation was based on the evidence of only one of 23 witnesses and was completely without foundation. In other words, Arthur had only himself to blame for his death. The interim report was issued on August 3, 1916, and a detailed version was promised before Christmas. In September, airmen based at Montrose began to notice curious things. Twice, one officer followed a figure in full flying kit towards the mess, only to see him vanish before reaching the door. A flying instructor woke up one night to find a strange man sitting in a chair beside the fire in his bedroom. When he challenged the intruder, the chair was suddenly emptied. 2 other men woke simultaneously one night, convinced a third person was in their room. Was Desmond Arthur trying to rally his old friends in the Royal Flying Corps to clear his name? As the story of the 2 hauntings spread around Britain's other air bases, 2 of the government's committee of inquiries revealed that they had not even seen the Royal Aero Club findings that their interim report had denigrated. After studying the results of the earlier investigations, Sir Charles Bright, an engineer, and a lawyer called Butcher, amended an amendment to the final report when it was issued that Christmas. They declared it appears probable the machine had been damaged accidentally and that the man or men responsible for the damage had repaired it as best as he or they could to evade detection and punishment. The ghost of the dead pilot appeared to settle for that as vindication of his innocence in causing the crash. After one last appearance in January 1917, Phantom Flyer Desmond Arthur was never seen again. Then there's another little mini segment that says Destination Death. A coroner's court was held in 1936 that a driver died because he saw the ghost of a London bus. The man's car careened into a wall at the junction of Cambridge Gardens and St. Mark's Road in North Kensington. And a witness swore that the driver swerved to avoid a general omnibus, which was ablaze with lights but had no driver or conductor. Residents in the area said they had frequently seen and heard the Phantom Number 7 bus racing down Cambridge Gardens in the early hours of the morning, usually vanished at the junction where the death crash happened. A bus inspector told the coroner he had seen the bus pull into his depot and then vanish. Shortly after the inquest, the wall which had claimed the driver's life was demolished under a road widening scheme to make the junction safer. The Erie bus has not been seen since. And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here. And this will wrap up at least part 4 associated with chapter 5 from the book The World's Greatest Ghosts. Once again, the theme being the ghosts of the highways and skyways. I thought I was going to wrap up the chapter this go around, but there's actually a couple more pages left, so I'm going to save it for another one. But let's talk about those actual encounters here. Lots of interesting stuff. The first one has to do with the pilot's pact. It's interesting because apparently there were these 3 pilots who apparently died. As is, they pretty much slammed into the ground. And because it happened so quickly as far as what occurred to their plane, and they ended up dying so instantly, it was almost like they didn't know. They decided to basically stay there and come back afterward, almost as if they were trying to still be alive. I've heard about that in other ghost stories as well. The idea that sometimes ghosts aren't aware that they're dead. Whatever happened to them, whatever caused their death, it basically makes them think that they're still alive. And so they're trying to interact with the people, sometimes to horrible results, sometimes to actually very nice results, like people are taking sympathy with them. That seemed to be more of the case here with regards to these 3 dead pilots. So interesting stuff that it happened to them, and they're still trying to contact people, and they made that pact as well. It's almost like a premonition of sorts. They basically made a pact that said if anything would happen to them, then they would show up at that location, at that aerodrome, and then that way they could easily try to communicate with each other or with other people that are out there. Next segment was the grief of Henry Watts. This one was pretty tragic. The idea, 14-year-old boy just basically died out there. Little Alfie Watts. He was doing a job. That job involved being something involving 3 horses, and then they suddenly bolted, and then that caused the boy to be thrown right in front of them, and then with the heavy wheels and then probably the horses themselves, he was crushed, and then he didn't survive what happened afterward. Makes it real tragic, the idea that one little cross was placed there with some initials, his initials AHP Watts, and then the date of his death, and then the rest of humanity went on after him. Like, in other words, the rest of the time period was just filled with people coming to and from. The grass would grow higher. Sometimes that cross would disappear behind the grass. Maybe some people paid attention to it afterward, but they would have no idea what occurred there. To me, that makes it very tragic overall, because a little boy's life was lost right there, but it's pretty much nothing to most people's lives as they go to and from, just because they have no idea of what occurred. It reminds me of some of the crosses that I see throughout some of the roads here in Austin. It always marks the location of what happened to someone. They ended up dying in some car accident. You don't think twice about it, but when you think about it afterward, you realize that that was the location that somebody actually died, like right on that spot, right at that exact moment in time, their life ended. And such is the case with little Alfie Watts. Next one has to do with a dead man's quest for justice. This one was interesting in the sense that it was the ghost of an airman who was trying to clear his name. Somebody who still remained anonymous to this day had done a repair job on that man's plane, but then they botched it. But instead of actually fixing it, they went the lazy route and just decided to conceal the work and then make it seem like it was 100% fixed, which unfortunately led to that man's biplane happening like where the wing tore itself apart right there in midair. And so because of it, the seatbelt snapped and then he was thrown out of the cockpit. And much to the horror of everyone watching, they saw him flailing his arms and legs as he crashed into the ground, all because of this one simple but deadly situation that whoever that anonymous person was, whoever laziness they had, ended up causing the death of that person. Now, I don't think that that person, whoever that was, that did this, didn't do it in the sense thinking that it would lead to someone's death. But at the same time, how can someone be so negligent? It's almost like if a mechanic was realizing that something was wrong with a job that they did on someone's engine, but they decided to still cover it up, and then that engine decides to go kaput right there in the middle of a highway, and then it leads to a crash, and then who knows how many other people it could impact with other crashes and deaths at the same time. Like, instead of spending the next 30 minutes fixing that situation, now we have several dead people. And so that's what it reminded me of here. The idea that someone's tomfoolery, that they were not taking care of business when they should have, or at least letting others know, hey, I messed up. They decided to just go ahead with just doing a simple fix that they knew was not going to get the job done. But hey, they had to get out of work, right? They had to go home or whatever was the case. And then it led to that man's death. So that ghost decided to appear again and again until finally someone was able to challenge the notion that the accident was actually caused by that man that used to be that ghost that used to be that man, and instead was caused by someone else, and then that ghost disappeared. So some justice associated with that. I also like that little mini segment that was associated with that spectral Spitfire. There's the idea that sometimes villagers can hear a flying bomb. How creepy is that? It's a location there near Folkestone, there at Hawkinge. Apparently, people can hear that whistle, the sound of a flying bomb. You've heard it in cartoons, and then it's been played in movies too. It's that whistle where something is coming into the ground. And if you can hear that there, you can just imagine the people running for cover, not realizing that it's a ghost bomb. It's like a ghost flying bomb. And yet there it is, and it's about to hit the ground, but no harm comes from it. But still, it causes that sound, that eerie sound. All right, everybody, let me know what your thoughts are below. Take care, everyone.